format. So we're going to go ahead and transition right over to someone who may not need an introduction for many of you, but I'll get to that in just a second. And then we're going to bring both these scientists back up and give everybody an opportunity to ask them some questions. So go ahead and type your questions into notes in your iPhone or whatever it works for you, however you might remember them. And then also want to mention that afterwards, when this is all over, we're going to have a nice reception across the foyer, and both authors will be there, and you'll have the opportunity to talk to them and purchase some of their books. So let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Jim Mcclintock. He is one of our very own. We're very proud of him. He is, of course, at UAB. He's the endowed professor of polar and marine biology there. Jim came to UAB in 1987 and has served in a variety of roles, all of which have been trying to understand things that are happening in Antarctica. And from that work, he's published well over almost 275 scientific articles. And like Steve, he has also published a couple of books from that work that are, I think, of interest to you. Both of these, I'm a little bit of an armchair adventurer. I love to read about other folks' adventures, and both of these books have been on my bedside table for a long time. One is Lost Antarctica, about his travels to Antarctica. I think you've spent 15 or more, 15 research seasons in Antarctica, and if you know much about that, that's a pretty hefty accomplishment just to have gone one single time. And then my favorite of his book, but I have a little personal bias towards this one, is A Naturalist Goes Fishing. And this is a wonderful book, and I encourage you to take a look at both of those when you go to the reception. Jim's work has been featured on a number of popular news outlets, including the Diane Rehm Show and On Point with Tom Ashbrook. It's also been published in magazines such as National Geographic, Smithsonian, and in newspaper articles like the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. And he has, from all of this work, been recognized quite a bit. I went to take a look at his CV, and I asked my computer to print it out, and it thankfully said, "Are you sure you want to print all 77 pages of this man's CV?" And I said, "No, don't do that." So let me just hit a few highlights. He's won a lot of teaching awards, a lot of scholarly awards, but some of the ways that he's been recognized: he serves on the advisory board for the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation. He is also a fellow in the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And then two of them that really spoke to me, so I thought I'd highlight them. In 2017, he was named a fellow in the Explorers Club, which is a really big deal. And then the one I think is I don't know if it's your favorite, Jim, but it's my favorite. He actually has a cape named after him. It's Mcclintock Point in Antarctica, and I think that's got to be pretty special. So come on up here and tell us about your work.
All right, it's a pleasure to be here. You know, the neatest thing about having a point of land in Antarctica named for me is I will never in my entire life be pointless. I love that. Okay. Now, if I can get my slides up. Okay, wonderful. I will never forget the first time that I put a dry suit on. I slipped through the ice, through a hole about 3 feet in diameter. The temperature of the water where I was at McMurdo was about minus 1.8 degrees. And I was a little paranoid because I could only see 3 inches in front of my nose. But when I dropped down below that ice, another world exploded in front of my eyes. You could see 500 feet of visibility here. It's the best diving in the world. The seafloor was covered with sponges and soft corals and starfish and sea urchins as far as you could see. And I spent 10 years of my life going down on field expeditions to McMurdo Station to study that life. How do these animals reproduce? How do they eat? What are they doing? I was a kid in a candy store. So little was known about their biology. I used to hear in the cafeteria people talk about another station called Palmer Station that was up on the peninsula. A little further north, they referred to it as the banana belt of Antarctica. And I wrote a grant proposal with some colleagues, and we got funded. And for the last 20 years, we've been working at Palmer Station, a small station. And I didn't realize that I was going to one of the most rapidly changing, warming regions of our planet. And that's what I want to talk about with you. And I think that's a great thing to do following Steve's wonderful presentation. What's going on in the real South? Well, here on the Antarctic Peninsula, we can kind of set the stage by looking at the whole world in terms of warming. This comes from National Geographic back in 2006. Look at how little attention there had been to the Antarctic. The only area that really was highlighted at that point in time as warming, so the bright orange, was the Antarctic Peninsula where I've been. But when scientists really started to look closely, here on the cover of Nature magazine, which is probably the most prestigious science journal in the world, you can see that it's not just the Antarctic Peninsula. It's not just that 800-mile length of peninsula, but the entire western portion of Antarctica is beginning to warm. And this is not trivial real estate. Antarctica is the size of India and China combined. Now, we also know that the ice shelves that are attached to Antarctica, 1,000-foot thick layers of ice attached to the land, are beginning to melt, even on the eastern side of Antarctica. And that's because the world's largest current, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which goes around Antarctica, is beginning to warm and melt those ice shelves. Well, how much warming are we talking about? What's the big deal? Well, it turns out that about 20 miles from where I live and work in Palmer Station, there's another station, a Ukrainian station, where they have been taking air temperatures for over 60 years. And if you plot those air temperatures, daily air temperatures, it's increased over this 60-year period about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That's amazing. I mean, this is really sort of as dramatic as what's happening in the Arctic, or maybe more so for the peninsula. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the glacier behind the station in our backyard, which used to drop a big chunk of ice into the water about once a week. It was such a big deal back then that we'd run down the hall, we'd throw open the door, we'd cram there looking out into the bay and watch big waves come by because the Mar Glacier had dropped a big chunk of ice. Very exciting. When I was at Palmer about 2 years ago, my most recent visit, this was happening every day. 3 or 4 times a day sometimes. You did not jump up and run down the hall. This is now the norm. 87% of the glaciers along the western Antarctic Peninsula are receding. We know that because of science. We know that when this science technician goes out and puts a GPS in his or her backpack and spends the day hiking the leading edge of the glacier talking to a satellite that's marking their position, and they come back and they add another line to the map, we can track how fast that glacier is receding. We can see where it was in the 1960s when that little picture of my colleagues Chuck and Maggie used to go down there, where they walk out the back door of the station and onto the glacier, and now you have to hike a half a kilometer. We know it from aerial photographs where you can see where the glacier was in 1975 and compare it with a more recent time, 2013. It's a very dramatic change. We also have amazing instruments. We have amazing technology. We can fix things. We can solve questions. We can measure things. This is an instrument on a satellite that measures the thinning of glaciers from space at an accuracy of a centimeter. And those red areas you can see are areas where the glaciers are thinning. They're melting. Notice it's mostly on the western side of the continent, not so much on the east, as I said. And look at Greenland in the northern hemisphere. That glacier is changing, and that ice sheet is melting. So this was a surprise, the Thwaites Glacier. This was a surprise to science. This was a surprise to everybody. It's not that we didn't know that the Thwaites Glacier was receding, we just didn't know how fast it was receding. It was breaking records. And the concern about it is that the Thwaites Glacier on the western side of the continent is a figurative cork. It is what the western ice sheet that sits on top of the continent slides through. Now, I haven't mentioned the fact that Antarctica is covered with 3-mile deep ice, but there is a lot of ice sitting on top of that continent. About 70% of our fresh water on the planet is locked into that ice sheet. That ice is not stationary. On the western side of the continent, the ice is sliding to the west, and on the east to the east. And it slides right through that Thwaites Glacier. And the concern is if the Thwaites Glacier disappears, the rate of flow of that ice from the ice sheets could be accelerated. Why do we care about that? Because ice that comes from land that enters the ocean contributes to sea level rise. And that's important to keep that in mind. Now there's some ice sheets that surround where I work on the peninsula. And I want to show you what's happening to some of those ice sheets. Look at the one over here, the Larsen B Ice Shelf. That ice shelf over there on the eastern side of the continent, or the peninsula, was photographed from space on January 31st, 2002. And the scientists that were doing this noticed that there were striations in that ice sheet. They came back a month later and the Larsen B Ice Shelf was breaking up. And 2 weeks later, the entire Larsen B Ice Shelf floated out to sea. This is a piece of ice 1,000 feet deep, the size of the state of Rhode Island. More recently, the Larsen C Ice Shelf was in all the news 2 summers ago. It developed a crack, and they followed that crack until literally a big chunk of the Larsen C Ice Shelf floated out to sea. It was about the 5th largest iceberg ever recorded in our history on this planet. It was an iceberg the size of Delaware. Isn't that remarkable? Well, the good news about all these ice sheet breakouts, if there's good news, is that when the ice melts from these ice sheets, it contributes nothing, virtually nothing, to sea level rise, because that ice is already in the ocean. It's the same physics as a glass of ice water. When your ice melts in the glass, the water doesn't come over the top of the glass. It stays at the same level. The concerning news about losing ice sheets, or ice shelves, I should say, is that they serve as barriers to the movement of the ice sheets off of the continent and into the ocean. And they know that once that ice shelf has disappeared, the rate of flow can be accelerated about 4 times. And that's part of the equation, part of the modeling that the IPCC that Steve mentioned is using to predict, but we're going to have between about 1/3 and 1 meter of sea level rise by the end of this century. So a meter, about 3 feet. And that's a big deal if you live in Miami. What's happening to the marine life as a result of this very rapid change, this warming that's going on the peninsula? Well, the most poignant story I can tell you about is the story of the Adelie penguin. Now, the fellow that's in the back of this photograph, Bill Frazier, is a good friend of mine. Bill came down here as a grad student to Palmer Station 45 years ago. As part of his doctoral dissertation, he tagged 16,000 breeding pairs of Adelie penguins. He's come back every year for 45 years to follow that population. And I want to show you what Bill has found. It's really quite concerning. So you can see the Adelie up in the top left-hand corner, the one that looks like Charlie Chaplin, got the little tuxedo on. And that purple line is Bill's data that shows that this population has dwindled over that period of time. He told me about a month ago in an email that this year we're looking at about 1,100 of the original 16,000 breeding pairs being left. So about 90% of these penguins have disappeared. And sadly, they're not moving. We know that because they don't show up elsewhere tagged. They're disappearing. In the meantime, the Gen 2 in the middle photograph and the chinstrap penguin on the far right have shown up. These are warmer weather penguins that are moving down the peninsula as it's warming. They're extending their range. Now there's fairly small numbers of them, but they have arrived, particularly the Gen 2. They are laying eggs, they're raising their chicks, they're moving in. Well, what you're wondering is why in the world are the Adelie penguins having such a tough time? Well, it all comes back to climate change, because what's happening on the peninsula is that ironically, as it's warming, it's also getting more humid. That means that it's snowing more, it's snowing later than it used to. So the Adelie penguins are genetically hardwired to show up at the same time every year, lay their eggs, and then along comes an unseasonably late snowstorm, covers the colony, and sadly, when that snow melts, the eggs drown. And so you can lose an entire generation of penguins in that one big storm. We also know that the sea ice Now, I haven't mentioned sea ice yet. Sea ice is only about 5 feet deep, but it doubles the size of the entire continent of Antarctica every winter and then breaks up in the summer and goes away. Sea ice is so regular, so predictable, that the life in Antarctica has evolved to live with it and as part of it. We call these sea ice dependent species. The Adelie penguin is a sea ice dependent species, and the sea ice is disappearing. They use the sea ice as a platform. They get down on their bellies and they toboggan across the sea ice out to the edge of the water where they catch krill, the little shrimp that form their food. It's so important. It's really the quintessential base of the food webs of Antarctica. Everybody eats krill, including Adelies. And so with the sea ice gone, Bill thinks they're putting a lot more energy into swimming offshore to get to the krill they're feeding on, and they're on a very tight energy budget to raise those chicks. So that's a difficult thing for them too. The other thing is the krill are having a tough time, because we have just learned within the last 20 years that when krill are teenagers, they live underneath the sea ice. They hide out under there and they eat little plants called diatoms. So as the sea ice is receding, we have the potential of an impact on the krill as well. In fact, anything that feeds on krill could be impacted, like the baleen whales that are doing so well right now. I saw 75 humpback whales in a single day the last time I went down to Antarctica. They're coming back. They're coming back from being hunted by us. It would be sad, to see them get hit by the loss of krill. Other animals that depend on sea ice could be impacted, like this beautiful Weddell seal, one of my favorite seals in Antarctica. This is a very interesting story of adaptation. The female Weddell seal has ice-chipping teeth. Her ice-chipping teeth allow her to go under the sea ice and find a weak spot and chip at it until she has a breathing hole. And then she continues to work at that breathing hole until it's big enough that she can slide right up through the hole, lay next to the hole, and give birth. And her pups are completely safe from predators like the killer whales and the leopard seals that are prowling out at the ice edge. And it's all because of her dentition. I mean, it's really remarkable. I don't think that these seals are going to disappear like the Adelie penguin, but they may have to follow the ice as it moves south. What about leopard seals? What about those seals that when we see them and we're diving, we drop a siren into the water to warn the divers to come together back to back and wait for that moment when the leopard seals are not quite as close, and they come up into the boat and we just grab them and pull them into the Zodiac, and we move to another spot to continue our research diving. Because leopard seals are top predators, 10 feet long, 1,000 pounds. These are beautiful animals. They really are. A leopard seal has never been seen to date giving birth anywhere but on a floe of sea ice. So we don't know if leopard seals are going to move to shore and give birth when the sea ice is gone or not. That's a question that remains. What about the little things in the water, the plankton, the tiny little phytoplankton and zooplankton? How are they being impacted? Well, the guy with the white hat here, Hugh Ducklow, is the head of the long-term ecological research program who's been following plankton populations along the peninsula for 30 plus years. They have been taking a ship and following these lines on the map. For each year, it takes about 8 weeks for them to sample all that area along the peninsula, sampling the chemistry of the water and the physics, the phytoplankton, the zooplankton. And I asked Hugh to do me a big favor. I said, could you put 30 years of data into one slide? And he did a pretty good job. What you're looking at in this slide is a comparison of the very northern tip of the peninsula and the southern portion. The two panels at the top are from the 70s and 80s versus the 90s and 2000s. And those two panels at the top show the northern portion of the peninsula. What's happening over time? Well, the weather's changing. In the big picture, we're going from a dry polar climate to a much more sort of sub-Antarctic, humid, warmer climate. The weather is changing. It's windier, it's cloudier. The heavy winds are churning up the surface of the ocean and pushing phytoplankton deeper where they don't get enough sunlight. Some of the favorite phytoplankton that krill like to eat are very, very much being impacted. The krill populations aren't as robust. And Hugh thinks that this is going to happen further down the peninsula as well. It hasn't quite happened there. So there are impacts. What's going to happen to the forests under the ocean in Antarctica on the peninsula? Don't look puzzled. Of course there's forests in Antarctica. Nobody ever told you. All you have to do is put on your scuba gear with me. We'll slide into the water in front of Palmer Station and we will swim into a forest. The seaweeds will tower over our heads. Some of the blades will be 10 feet long. Well, these forests are probably going to be very happy in a warming world because the sea ice is going to be gone. They're going to get more light. They're probably going to grow deeper, the forests. They may extend further down the peninsula than they have been before. But they could also be impacted in a way we don't really understand. We know that they make chemical defenses from our own studies. We know that these seaweeds produce chemistry that tastes terrible to predators like the little crustaceans that want to eat them. Well, with more sunlight, they have more energy that could change the type of chemistry or the amount of chemistry they produce, and we could have a system where who eats who is impacted. We don't know. What about the tiny little larvae, the babies of sponges and soft corals and starfish and sea urchins that are known as larvae, this tiny little larva that you're looking at that will undergo a metamorphosis as dramatic as a caterpillar into a butterfly, only in this case, a sea star. This is a baby sea star. This little larva, as we well know from our work, takes a very long time to develop in Antarctica. In fact, it takes about 4 months, which is very, very long. In the temperate and tropical areas, this would be 4 weeks. We also know that if you collect these larvae and you bring them in the lab and you warm the temperature just 2 degrees, they'll develop much quicker. Instead of 4 months, they'll develop in 2 months because they've never experienced warming water. It doesn't kill them outright, but it charges them up. Well, that might be good. It might be they're in the water for less time. It means they don't get eaten by as many things, but it could also be a problem because they feed on plankton. These larvae feed on plankton, and the plankton bloom at a particular time. What if they show up at the cafeteria and the door's still locked? They could be offset from their food, and climate scientists are worried about that in all parts of the world. What else is showing up because it's warming? Well, we didn't used to have elephant seals here. They've been further up the peninsula. But they've arrived, and they've established a breeding colony. And on a warm summer day, there can be a dozen 2-ton elephant seals laying in the middle of the station. Do you know what that smells like? And we also not only have elephant seals, but we have fur seals that have arrived from further up the peninsula as it's warmed. They haven't established a breeding colony, but they might. These are called range extensions. And probably the most dramatic range extension I can share with you today is the story of kind of an interesting critter that we didn't expect to find in Antarctica. And let me tell you the backdrop for this. This is a picture of the ancient seafloor of Antarctica. It's ancient because it's ancient today. The seafloor communities of Antarctica were established 45 million years ago when Antarctica separated from South America and allowed the establishment of that Antarctic current. It locked Antarctica into a refrigerator. The species that could adapt did, and many didn't. There's no sharks in Antarctic waters. There's no fish in Antarctic waters with crushing jaws. All 250 species of Antarctic fish are wimps. They have weak little jaws and they feed on little crustaceans. There's nothing in Antarctica with a claw. There's no crabs, there's no lobsters. So the organisms that evolved in this ecosystem are very weakly defended. Why produce a big thick shell if there's nothing that can crush me? And if I was to hand Steve an Antarctic clam, he could take it with 2 fingers and crush the shell. So you can imagine the shock of my colleague Sven Thatchy, who in 2007 was flying a remotely operated submarine up the slope of Antarctica and for the first time ever came across king crabs on the slope. Why was this such a surprise? Because we knew that king crabs lived in the deep sea around Antarctica for a very long time. But as you go up the slope, the temperatures actually get colder. And we know that crabs can't do well at low temperature. They can't regulate magnesium in their body fluids. They become drunk. They fall over. They can't find their mouth to feed themselves. They are narcotized at low temperature. So maybe what we're seeing is that these temperatures, these warmer temperatures that are now reaching the deep, are allowing king crabs to move up the slope. And while I wrote a grant proposal with a colleague in Florida to study this question, another group of scientists happened to come across about 1.5 million of these king crabs in a deep canyon within sight of Palmer Station. Well, we got our grant, and we've been going to Antarctica for the past 10 years. We've done 3 cruises where we take a ship to Antarctica, we lease a submarine from Woods Hole, we drag the submarine up the Antarctic slope and onto the shelf in 10-kilometer-long transects. We take pictures of the seafloor every 15 seconds. You can imagine the tens of thousands of pictures that we have to try to establish where those crabs are. And when you have tens of thousands of things to do, you have to use a very special scientific instrument that we call the graduate student. And we have many of these. You always want lots of these instruments in your lab. And they were able to demonstrate that the king crabs are on the slope in the millions, but they have not reached the shelf. So hopefully they won't. Let me just tell you the last thing that I'm concerned about in Antarctica, as all oceans, and that is ocean acidification. Doesn't get near the press that climate warming does, but it's very concerning. Because what's happened to 1/3 of the carbon dioxide that we've added to the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels has gone into the world's oceans. And they've become about 30% more acidic in that time. So if you make a shell, that can be a challenge. It doesn't necessarily mean that you won't be able to make a shell anymore. You'll just have to spend more energy to do it because you're losing the shell to the acidity dissolving it. Antarctica is the canary in the coal mine for ocean acidification because the colder the water, the more carbon dioxide is absorbed. Basic physics. It's a cold sea, the coldest. And I already told you, things in Antarctica don't have big shells to begin with. So they can't afford to lose too much of their shell. You can go to Antarctica today, and you can dip a beautiful little sea butterfly like this out of the water. It's the size of the tip of a pencil, as common as the stars in the sky, so common that they're part of the global carbon cycle. And you can look at it under a microscope, and you can see the beginnings of dissolution of the shell, etching on the aragonite shell from ocean acidification. So this is not our grandchildren's problem. This is happening now. Well, we got some money from NSF to study ocean acidification, and we've had 2 of our UAB students spend very long field seasons. I think they were each down there for 6 months twice, doing ocean acidification research, using controlled conditions to study it. Bottom line is that some animals are pretty good at dealing with future acidity, and others are having a really tough time. And one of the types of animals that's having a tough time is an amphipod. These are little crustaceans. There's one in this picture for you. And I just got to tell you this quick story of discovery because it's so fun. When I was at McMurdo Station, I looked down through an ice hole and saw this. I saw a little crustacean carrying an orange backpack. And I took it up to the lab and I showed my colleague, John Jansen, and I said, "What's going on here?" And he said, "Well, let's take it off." We took the backpack off and it opened its wings and it flew away. It was a little sea butterfly. It's a naked sea butterfly. They don't have shells. And we found many of them out in the field carrying sea butterflies. Why would you go to all the trouble to carry another species on your back? So we did the logical experiment. We brought them in the lab. We took the little sea butterfly off the back of the little amphipod. We offered it to a fish, ate it every time, and then we offered it with the little sea butterfly to the fish. Well, the fish would take it in their mouth and then spit it right back at you. And that was because the sea butterfly was loaded with chemicals that taste terrible to fish. So this was a very smart amphipod. It was abducting and carrying another species to protect itself. Never been seen in nature. And that's why it was published in Nature. All right, so summary. These are all the things that are happening. The glaciers receding, the ice sheets breaking up. organisms moving, their range is extending. It's dramatic. We're going from a system that looked like this for millennia. We're going from a system that had very predictable sea ice, it had a robust population of Adelie penguins, lots of krill, a seafloor community, forests, and all being fed by this rich, nutrient-rich ACC, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. And here's where we're headed. Probably mid-century, certainly no later than the end of the century. The sea ice is going to be gone with the Adelie penguin following. There won't be as much krill. We may have king crabs, we don't know. And the forests will have extended their range because they have more light. And again, all being fed by this current. Now the interesting thing is you're probably wondering what the big deal is, because marine or any ecosystem changes with time. We know that. But what we're so concerned about, biologists, is that it's happening so fast. This is happening over decades, not hundreds of years or thousands of years. So when people ask you, what's the big deal about climate change? The big deal is the rate of change, because biological systems are not necessarily adapted to changing that quickly. That's the big deal. So why should we care? I mean, think about it. How far is it from Little River Canyon to Antarctica? Out of sight, out of mind, right? Well, let me give you a very practical reason about why it might be important to think about this. So while we're studying chemicals in sponges and soft corals to see what their ecological role is and how they might protect a sea butterfly, we're also doing drug discovery. I work with a chemist who does drug discovery, Bill Baker. And we have found, as we collect, that you get a little bit extra stuff, you extract it, you send the chemicals off to the National Cancer Institute, the Cystic Fibrosis Research Center at UAB, all sorts of companies that are interested in screening our chemicals, and you find things like this. I mean, who would guess that right in front of the station, the seafloor is covered with this common tunicate called sinoicum, and that we've named a chemical we found in it after the station, palmerolide, sent it to the National Cancer Institute, and they called us up. And they said, we screen this against 20 different kinds of human cancers. We really are excited because it's only active against one type of cancer, and it's very potent. Those are two things we look for, specificity and potency. Can we work on it? And we said, of course. So they made it in the laboratory. Because you can't go to Antarctica with a ship and harvest this, right? And they found out that it can move through membranes and cells and tissues to get to cancer. And now we have the gene. We've figured out the sequence of the gene that produces this chemical. We could put this gene into an E. coli bacteria and say, go to work. Make a drug that fights melanoma skin cancer. And there aren't very many drugs to fight melanoma. And we found a chemical in an Antarctic sponge that we published recently in a chemical journal that was downloaded 500,000 times. This was a big deal because it was the first chemical ever to show activity against MRSA as a biofilm form. So this is when you go to the hospital for your knee transplant and you get the film of mucus and protein growing on the implant, and MRSA gets under there, and this is something that's very hard to get rid of. The surgeons have told me they have to take out the knee implant, clear you for 5 or 6 weeks, and redo the surgery a second time. It's very much a problem. So my point here is ancient ecosystem, ancient chemistry, huge diversity of chemicals for humanity. Why would we squander this? Why would we give it up for changing the climate? Now, I used to get asked this question as I traveled the country talking about climate change. I have not been asked this question in a long time. I would say 5 years. And you can go online and Google global warming, climate change, whatever term you want to use, and I want to show you the data that convinced me finally that it's real. There is absolutely no way that anybody can take these data to task, right? In science, we call these hard data. These are hard data. So what I get asked now is, hey, so it's warming. Do we have anything to do with it? Or is this just a natural cycle that we're going through? And so I say, well, hey, the answer is in Antarctica where I work. How cool is that? The answer is in the ice sheets that sit on top of Antarctica. And what you're looking at here is a core through an ice sheet. You're looking at a core of ice that goes down 3,600 meters through that ice. And the core is about the diameter of an apple. And as that core comes up, locked in it are little air bubbles. And the deeper you go down through the ice, the older those air bubbles are in our history. You can see the axis goes back, 420,000 years at the base of this ice core. That's when that air bubble formed that had that atmosphere in it. And amazingly, you can analyze the CO2, the greenhouse gas that's in that air bubble. In the red line is where the CO2 is in this graph. You can look at the temperature indirectly. That's the blue line. But look at the CO2 levels over time. Look at that big black line I've drawn across the top of those 100,000-year cycles. CO2 in our atmosphere over the last 420,000 years has never been higher than 300 parts per million. Look what happens over on the far right when we get to the Industrial Revolution and we start burning fossil fuels. The amount of CO2 in our atmosphere shoots up. I mean, literally, this needs to be updated because 380 parts per million does not meet the current level. The current level is about 412, 413 parts per million. It's 25% higher than it has ever been over the last 420,000 years, and this has now been extended back to over 1 million with the same story. So to me as a scientist, you have to make up your own mind, but this is very, very strong evidence that we are much responsible for the problem. I can't tell you if it's 60% or 80%, but I do believe it's very significant. And you wanted to know why those red lines go up and down in a 100,000-year cycle, didn't you? That's because of the Milankovitch cycle, which is the elliptical orbit of our Earth around the sun in a 100,000-year period. So, is Antarctica that far from us? Is it disconnected? Is all that stuff happening down there have nothing to do with us? Well, guess what? Not necessarily. You might not have ever heard of the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt, but that Antarctic circumpolar current has a huge influence on both the Pacific and the Atlantic in the northern hemisphere, which is tied into things like atmospheric pressure, humidity, air temperatures, wind patterns. Antarctica is a global climate maker. So what happens there does have a potential impact here. If you look at temperature changes in Alabama, you'd look at this that recently was published by NOAA, you'd say, hey, the South looks great. Why isn't it warming? Well, it has to do with the fact they think that there's just a lot of particulates in the atmosphere that have kind of been keeping us behind schedule. And now we're starting to warm up like everybody else. So we're not off the hook. And you may have noticed, but we are having hotter days. We are having hotter days. We have days with 108 effective temperature if you count the humidity. What it feels like is 108. It might be 99. I guarantee you we are having more hotter days. That's a problem. As the Dean of Public Health at UAB was telling me the other day, we're having to treat a lot more people for heat stroke, heat-related things. We're having to open more places for people to get out of the heat. This is going to be a continuing problem. Now we know that as the seas warm, we don't necessarily have support that there's more hurricanes, but I can tell you that we watched 3 Category 5s come across the Atlantic last year, and if I'm not mistaken, the one that just came across turned into a 5, and the one that destroyed Mexico Beach, which I drove through 3 weeks after it came through, Hurricane Michael, was reclassified as a 5. This is amazing. I think what's happening, and climate scientists are believing that we're getting more powerful hurricanes, not necessarily more of them, but because they come across this very warm body of water. They charge up. What else does Antarctica do for Alabama? Well, it contributes to our sea level rise because those ice shelves, those ice sheets, I should say, are melting. And that means that when you look at our history of sea level rise, that some of that's coming probably from Antarctica. And we are in an area where sea level has been rising. We have about 4 to 6 inches of sea level rise, and this is only up to 2011. So what are we going to have? We're probably not going to have what Miami has. We're not going to have seawater in our streets at high tide like they do now. But have you been to the west end of Dauphin Island? I mean, that you see houses now that are becoming part of the ocean. So certainly coastal properties are going to be impacted in Alabama. One of the things about rainfall that I've noticed is that we get rain, maybe not more inches a year, but it rains harder than it used to. I see my Cahaba River, which I dearly love, filled with chocolate water and the banks being eroded by these very, very heavy rains. So one of the things that climate change brings is more erosion in our rivers. All right, so gloom and doom, right? Well, Alabama is not only suffering from businesses being impacted by this, but there is good news out there. And I'm going to start by sort of quickly giving you a good news story at the global level and then a good news story for Alabama. All right, who would have thought that in 1985, two scientists would be sitting at their desk in Antarctica and they'd tell the boss in England that they had this data that they were sending them and that he might not believe them, and he wrote back and said, "I don't. I'm sending you back to Antarctica again next year with a new spectrophotometer. You're going to take those measurements again and tell me what you find." And they found the same thing. They couldn't believe it. And they published this paper in Nature that's maybe the most important paper of the 20th century, announcing a massive hole in the ozone, that layer of our atmosphere that protects us from ultraviolet radiation that even impacts climate. Amazing story. Well, even more amazing, 2 years later, 20 countries sat down around a table in Montreal, Canada, and ratified the Montreal Protocol that regulated the chlorofluorocarbons, the refrigerants that were destroying our atmosphere. And guess what? Today, 197 signatories to the Montreal Protocol. It is probably the most successful treaty, global treaty of all time. And even better, it's worked. Susan Solomon, the woman who found the chemistry behind the hole in the ozone, who's at MIT, told me that now they think mid-century, not end of century, that hole's closing. And guess what? The companies that made the refrigerants didn't go out of business. They came up with new technologies for new refrigerants. Jobs weren't lost. It's a wonderful model for what we could do to deal with this major issue. Now, how might Alabama do a better job? Well, I kind of am interested in searching around to see what we're doing in the state with renewable energy that would help us with our carbon. And also having cleaner air. So we've got big dams that produce electricity. I don't think we're going to be building more dams, to be honest. There's too many issues. So wind power, you can buy wind energy right now from Texas. They don't know what to do with it all. They have free electricity in some Texas towns from 8 to 10 at night from wind. But I don't think we're set up for wind like Texas might be in terms of our weather. But we do have a huge potential for solar. We're the number 13 state in the country for solar energy in terms of sunlight. But we're probably in the bottom, or 25 to 30 range for what we're doing, less than 1%. So there's a lot of potential. But there's some things happening. When I started poking around, I was really surprised. We have a huge solar farm that's being built in Chambers County that's going to be sufficient to power 17,000 homes. And this is another solar field that's going in at Montgomery, bigger, 20,000 homes. And guess what? The company that's building this with the local utility is a subsidiary of British Petroleum. Wow. What's going on? Google is coming, as you know, to northern Alabama. Well, they didn't show up until they got a deal. They're not going to build unless they've got carbon neutrality. So they're building a solar field in Tennessee and one in Alabama to provide their energy for this. So it can be done. UAB. I'm so proud of them. They have announced that by 2025, 20% of our electricity is coming from renewable sources. Do you know that we are the biggest customer for electricity in the state of Alabama? That is a huge investment in renewable energy. So, let me just end very quickly by telling you what I'm doing for outreach, because this is all about wanting to get people to think about this issue. So how do you do that? Well, first you got to write a book, right? You got to write Lost Antarctica and A Naturalist Goes Fishing. And to write a book, I found out you have to have a literary agent. And to have a literary agent, you have to have a book. Well, that didn't work. So if you don't have those things, you have to know somebody. Well, I was very fortunate that E.O. Wilson was a friend. E.O. Wilson is the most famous living scientist. He was born in Birmingham. He grew up in Mobile. He went to the University of Alabama, and then he spent 65 years at Harvard. E.O. Wilson was kind enough to find me a literary agent, and when Lost Antarctica was released, I got a phone call from his director of his foundation. She said, we're putting you on the board, and we want to do a little 3-minute video about your penguin chapter on the Adelie. It's going to go in all the zoos and aquariums. And I thought she was hinting around that she wanted me to read for this video from my book, because she said, we love the prose. And she said, no. She said, we'll have Harrison do it. And I said, Harrison who? And she said, Harrison Ford, of course. He's on the committee with you. He's one of your buddies. And I said, okay. So Harrison did read from my book, and you can go to YouTube and you can watch Ghost Rookeries and listen to Harrison reading about the penguins. So he is really kind to do that. And then this guy, who would guess that my book played into a day was this guy? Who would guess that I'd be asked to show around this person at the station coming the next day on a yacht, but they couldn't tell me who it was. And I said, why? And they said, security. And I said, but we're in Antarctica. And they said, well, it's Bill Gates. So I showed Bill and his father around the station the next day, and after lunch I took them up to the big room like this with the big screen where we show them the NSF film, and they were sitting in 2 chairs up front I'd put there for Bill and Bill his father, and in came the IT guy, and he could not get Microsoft to boot up. And this went on for like 2 minutes. Do you know how long that is? And finally his father looked at him and went, I said, Bill, you've got to do something about this. And I thought, that's my Microsoft moment. Bill was kind enough to read the book before it was published and wrote a nice little book jacket on it for it. So thank you, Bill Gates. And then I take people to Antarctica. What better way to share the wealth? I've taken over 250 people from Birmingham, Alabama to Antarctica. We get on the cruise ship, there's 200 guests, and they keep wondering why they keep running into people from Alabama. What's going on? Anyway, the cruise is an educational cruise to teach people about climate change. And it's a wonderful thing. We visit the station where I work, and they get to see the science, and they love it. And then I've also been doing work with faith groups, because I really believe that the protection of our Earth is very much inherent in faith, the care of creation. And I've done workshops, and I've been keynote speaker for several large faith conferences lately to talk about climate. And then I become the face of the Can We Talk Climate campaign by the Nature Conservancy, an organization that has several million members internationally. It's a very nice pledge. You go online, you pledge not a penny. I love pledges like that. You pledge that within 7 days of signing the pledge, you'll talk to one other person about climate change. That's all you got to do. And then you go online and you look at the website, and it tells you how to talk to Uncle Joe, who doesn't believe in global warming. And you talk to, here's some ideas about finding common ground. Talk about the tomatoes and how they're, coming in earlier than they used to. And, why can't they get beach insurance on their beach house anymore? Why can't they get house insurance? Things like that. And then I'm going to end right here on a wonderful moment that was recent, where I was invited to New York City to be awarded the Finn Rohn Award that the Explorers Club gives to a scientist who works in Antarctica. And lo and behold, Fern, my wife, and I found ourselves being feted with 8 Apollo astronauts. They were celebrating the 50-year anniversary of landing on the moon. How cool was it to have dinner with the Apollo astronauts? And how cool was it when one of them stood up when they were asked to say a few closing words, looked down the row of astronauts and said, you know what? All of us up on the stage have been in space, and we've all looked back at this Earth, and we all know how fragile it is. And that really touched me. That is amazing. All right, I'll stop there, and Steve's going to come up, and we're going to take questions.
So we've got some microphones. When we get them all set up, what we're going to do is bring the microphone to you. So if you have a question, signal to Pete or I, and we'll bring you a microphone, and then everybody will be able to hear your
That's good
question.
too.
Any questions for these guys?
We can't see anybody.
Right, you'll have to just, I like those kind of questions.
Me too.
You don't know who you're talking to.
Hi, this is Jim Roch. I grew up in this community. This is a question for each of you. If you were 12 years old today, as one of my grandsons is, and you thought you were going to head in the direction that you're heading, what would you do differently?
You want to do that one first?
I can't remember being 12 years old. I think the answer for me was to fall in love with nature and work passionately every single day for this amazing place. And it's that simple. And there's, if you want a bullseye that you can follow, that is one that is durable, and everything in life depends on that love that we all care about, that we share. And nature is a real centering sort of thing to love.
Jim, that's a great question, and I completely agree with Steve. And, we see it now. My kids are off, they're 24, 26. We're close to that, right, Fern? Anyway, technology's really made a big dent in kids getting outside, and I think I'm hoping that that's going to shift back somewhat. I know that when I ask my students at UAB to stand up the first day of class and tell me where they're going to be in 10 years, I am seeing more and more of them talk about, well, I want to go into environmental work. I want to do something for the environment. I want to go into research in field biology. It's not, and I'm seeing more of that. So I think there is a growing consensus among young people that this is an issue. Climate change and preservation of our planet is getting to be a bigger and bigger deal. And we're seeing it all around the planet, children who are speaking up. And that can be a very powerful voice.
It's one of the most honorable career tracks, taking care of what we call home.
Yep.
How closer to the importance of what we all represent, what we all live for, can you get?
Absolutely.
So, and a 13-year-old could do the same thing. And same with a 25-year-old.
That's
even
right.
60-year-old farms.
Even, that's right. You're 60?
65.
Oh, I'm only 25. No.
This is directed at Jim.
Mm-hmm.
The macroalgae forests that you're seeing increasing in size in Antarctica, can we get insight from what's happening off of the West Coast, in the kelp forests off the West Coast?
Those are two very different systems in many ways. And I will say that we can't see that these forests are actually growing. That's sort of the prediction that they will as light. We haven't had any measurements to back that up, but I think it's a fair prediction because we are losing the sea ice and we are going to have much more sunlight in that part of Antarctica. What's happening off of the coast of California and Oregon and Washington with the kelp forests, there has been some concern. We're having areas of the world's oceans now that are called the Blob. Have you heard of the warm water blob?
Yeah.
There's been one in the North Pacific. There's one off the Atlantic. And these are challenging for kelps that form those seaweeds. I know that. So it's a different set of challenges. But yeah, it's a good question and a good point.
I've got a colleague at UC Santa Barbara that's looking at some of the invasive urchins and some of the invasive algae that are coming in and traumatizing that system. But I don't know anything about it.
That's a very good point, Steve, and I should point that out, that one of the downsides of warming oceans and climate change is that you do tend to have more invasives. You have species coming into areas where they're not native. And often when that happens, they find it easy to make a big stand because their natural predators may not be there. Many of you may have heard of lionfish. And when I take my UAB students to the Bahamas for a field course, we now routinely are snorkeling and seeing lionfish everywhere. And there's actually an industry growing now where they're fishing. They're spearing lionfish and serving them in restaurants. They're apparently very good to eat. You have to be very careful to clean them because they have a very toxic fins that you can get stuck by. they're a problem because lionfish have a big mouth and they sit next to the reef and just eat everything that swims by. And there's no natural predators. They're now also off the coast of Alabama. They've moved up into the Gulf of Mexico. Good point.
This is Carla Holder. I have a question for both of you. Are we close to a tipping point? Are we running into difficult waters, to say?
Well, this is an interesting question that comes up frequently. I think scientists have a hard time saying for sure if we're at a tipping point or if it's going to happen in the near future or if we've already crossed one. I can tell you right now, though, that 10 years ago, I did not think I would be sitting here having seen as much change with my own eyes as we have. I think scientists, and maybe you could correct me, Steve, but are generally, as a body of scientists, surprised that it's happening, these changes are happening as rapidly as they are. I sort of perceived it as something my children were going to be facing. So I think there is a sense of urgency. There's no question that some of what we're doing to the planet is being baked in. And I'll give you the example from ocean acidification. Because what happens when carbon dioxide is absorbed in the world's oceans, it happens fairly rapidly. That reaction is rapid. The reaction of carbon dioxide bleeding out of the oceans and diminishing the amount of carbon dioxide can take hundreds, even thousands of years. So to bring the oceans back to their original pH levels, their acidity levels, is a much longer process than what we're doing to them. And that's just one example. So yeah, I think it is urgent. On the other hand, I think we have to be practical in terms of how we address it. I think it has to be a process and not something that we can do overnight. But we certainly need to be moving in that direction.
From my perspective, my background is as a fire ecologist. I'm not a soil scientist. So I've studied the fire ecology of the boreal ecosystems on the planet just a little bit down latitude or up latitude, from the poles.
From the
the
poles,
boreal
right.
is some of the largest forested, and taiga, some of the largest nearly forested systems on the planet that remain. And what's happening is fire sizes, fire intensity, and fire rate of spread are hugely larger than they were historically. There's evidence of 20 million acre fires historically, old fire scars from thousands of years ago. But now we're seeing 5 million acre fires, 10 million acre fires, just huge changes in fire behavior. The ecosystems that are supported by those systems, the fire scars are locations that bring in moose and bring in grouse and bring in all sorts of neotropical migratory birds that we all love, appreciate, and goshawks and the timber wolves, and this collection of this really interesting cycle responding to a fire scar or fire incident. What's happening is some of the major species are declining. Moose with a whole series of new diseases, new insect vectors, in part because of warming and in part because of, in some places, white-tailed deer moving up into the range of moose, with white-tailed deer harboring some of the brainworms and other insects. So what we're seeing at very large scales are some very, very rapid changes, and I don't know, we've got good graphs showing trajectory, and for me it's pretty frightening to see the terrestrial systems being traumatized. Is the way, if you use a human health analogy, if I don't know exactly how to say it medically, but if our systems, our blood chemistry, or our ability to transfer oxygen across the alveoli in our lungs went through the changes that we're seeing in some of these ecosystems, if there was a way to compare those, the medical analogy is really, really of concerning to me when you start thinking about it at the scale that these things are happening.
We're running a fever. Two things that come to mind. When I grew up in California, we used to have a fire season. They don't talk about fire seasons in California anymore.
Yeah.
It's all year. And the other thing I was going to mention about moose, there are ghost moose. Have you ever heard of a ghost moose?
I'm afraid of big female moose with babies. What's
So a ghost moose,
something you have more nightmares about?
no, this is not a figment of the imagination. I read about this. They actually, the fur is whitish,
Oh, I've
and
seen
they
it.
call them ghost moose. And the reason is the tick load
Yeah.
on the moose is so high that they've become anemic, and for some reason it has an effect on the coloration of the fur. And this is thought to be tied to warming climate too.
I've seen it where they have almost a mange, and you see the skin through the fur
Right,
fins.
right.
So yeah, so there's all sorts of indicators that the ecosystem is being traumatized, and whether the ecosystem is durable enough and resilient enough is the key question. I think Jim's point about the rate of change, it's really difficult to adapt, I believe, to changes that are quick. So,
But certainly we're not at a point where we say there's no hope. I mean, there is, there is hope. We need to treat it. We need to treat the planet. Yeah.
and some of the solutions are, really, really within range, within grip, and all it takes is leadership and decisions.
Yeah, I believe we have the technology, we have the know-how. I have tremendous respect for the American capacity to move ahead and address big issues. We have a long history of doing that. So I'm optimistic that we will be able to do this. It's just getting the inertia. Yeah.
Any last questions? My name is Barrett Bible. Do you know of any good resources that teachers could use to teach kids in schools about climate change?
So there's a National Association of Science Education or something. I don't know if I've got the acronym right, but there is a lot of resources online for teachers interested in introducing students to climate change. I know this because I recently led a workshop at the McWane Science Center called Penguins in a Warming World for 60 middle school science teachers. And just to get them thinking about curriculum that they can take back to the classroom. A lot of science teachers in Alabama, you're supposed to teach, according to the state regulations, you're supposed to teach climate change in the 6th grade. And they feel a little nervous about it because some of them said they get a little bit of kickback from parents. And so to have a curriculum, like you're suggesting, something that they find online, or they come to the McWane Science Center and go home with, a bag full of stuff that they can do, hands-on experiments and share information, they love that. They were very pleased. So that's a great question, and there is a lot of good resources out there. The National Science Foundation has resources for teachers on climate change. NOAA does as well, believe it or not.
Fish and Wildlife Service.
EPA maybe used to, I'm not sure. But yeah, certainly it's out there.
It's in the archives, I think.
It's in the archives, right.
So if you're interested, climate change, the story starts with, I think, a more fundamental understanding of how the ecosystems are organized and fundamental relationships. And what we learned, I learned as a vicarious soil scientist working with Ratan Lal and the key soil scientists on the planet, was they're really good at talking science amongst themselves, but they, 29 or 30 books or 50 books later, nobody understands it. It's very, very challenging technically. So I and a number of other people have written 2 documents. One of the books is here, and it's S is for soils. I don't know if you want to show it, Tim. And then with an organization called kidsgardening.org out of Burlington, Vermont, there's an online curriculum that relates soil and plant biology to climate. It's an online curriculum, and then this is the little companion document. And this is, for a scientist to write a book where everything is, well, Jim, let's test it on you.
No.
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 Look, what is that? That's an image showing all sorts of microbes in a long line with a sign pointing to the unemployment office.
That's a great way to do it.
Kids get it.
I love the metaphor.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, put your microbes back to work is what that's suggesting.
Right, it's great.
So there's different ways to take climate on and break it down in ways that are useful for all age groups, if that makes sense.
What I find very effective in communicating climate change is storytelling.
Exactly.
If you tell the story of that encounter with the seal on the beach that's died or the penguin that's disappearing. People have compassion for that moment, and as you still tell more and more stories, there's a level of trust that's established, a relationship. And I think that scientists could do a better job of using storytelling instead of vocabulary that's often confusing to the public. So I think that books, I admire your writing for kids. I mean, you must be a much better author than I am.
Trust me, this is the hardest book I've ever worked on. But the graphics is what makes it usable.
That's right.
Hell with the words. Sorry.
Yeah. It's all about pictures. Yes. All right. Thank
Gentlemen, we have just reached the 6 o'clock mark, and I wanted to point out that our own Dr. Nikki Weiner, who is our education director here at the Canyon Center, has just become a certified National Geographic climate teacher. And Nikki, just want to say a word about what that means.
He said I have to come into the light. So I actually just went through a program you were talking about for teachers, and you mentioned it briefly. I did 2 different programs with National Geographic. So the first is actually an Educator Certification program. So it's over several months, but it culminates with a capstone project, and it teaches you a lot of just the basics of teaching environmental education to your students. But specifically, they have an online program. It's free, which is always wonderful if you're a teacher especially, and it focuses on teaching climate change in the classroom. So it's a lot of modeling, storytelling, and it is a wonderful program. It takes you from the very beginning and the basics of climate change and how to break that down and really tell your students and teach your students. So it's a great free opportunity for teachers to really touch on those topics like you were saying.
Great.
So.
And with that, I'm kind of sad to say it, but this is coming to a close. And this is the first of what we hope to be a series that we'll call the Canyon Science Seminars. And we hope to have the APT productions produced within months. But Tony Gravett from the university has been recording, and that will be available online, the entire presentation, more quickly, probably in a couple of days or a week. And with that said, I really wanted to thank everyone from JSU who has helped with today, especially the JSU Canyon Center staff that's helped put all this together. Also want to thank this community for coming out. Mayor Chesser is here. We have other elected officials. We have had superintendents here. City Council woman Brewer is here. Really, it's just great to have a community like this. Jimmy Durham from the Economic Development Council is here, and we have a community that cares. We have a community that's engaged, and with your support, we'll continue to do this kind of thing. But more than anything, of course, we really want to thank our speakers for being here today. Jim, Steve, it's just fantastic, and we hope this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation. Their books will be right over here in the room. We have beer, we have wine, we have sodas, we have lots to eat. Well, we don't have a lot to eat, but we have a little bit to eat. And, but in any case, let's head straight over. Let's not do any chit-chatting right here. One more round of applause and head next door.
Pleasure.
And that's awesome.
Make a good team.
That's awesome. Pretty good, Jim.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was
Appreciate it.
So I've never been in a